The Grenada government is committed to improving the lives of citizens. Government announces early payment of January salaries for public officers.
Traditionally, government would make payments to public officers on the second to last day of the month. In this case, for January 2019, we have decided to make early payments to public officers on the 21st of this month. This has not been done in over a decade.
Public officers to get a 4% salary increase.
You would recall that the government would have negotiated with the trade unions for a 10% increase for public officers over a 3-year period. 2017, 3%, 2018, 3%, and 2019, 4%. We would kick off the 4% payment, which is to the tune of $6.7 million on January 21st, 2019.
January salaries to include increments.
Every year, public officers move incrementally in their pay and grade scale. This year, we are paying increments to the tune of $3.6 million, and that would also be included in the January 21st payment.
Will pensioners also benefit?
Pensioners' income is indexed to the salary increases of the public officers. So the 4% increase that public officers is due for 2019, pensioners would also benefit from that 4% increase.
Your government at work, delivering on promises made.
And transact the business in this house at Mount Weldale on this 23rd day of January 2019. I am further advised by the proclamation that the affairs of this youth parliament will be conducted with wisdom, temper, and prudence, and that upon all occasions, the right of all citizens and members will be recognized and respected.
Honorable members, I am not unmindful of the honor which have been conferred on me today in electing me to this highest of office, that of your Speaker and your servant. It will be my aim and duty to uphold the principles and traditions of this House and to secure for each member the right to express his or her opinions within the limit necessary to preserve the decorum of this House. I pledge to recognize the rights and privileges of the honorable members and the House itself. I wish also to assure you that I will preside in a manner which will facilitate the transaction of a debate in an orderly manner, and above all, I will seek to be fair and impartial in the decisions the rules of Parliament and yourself entrust to me.
Item 4, resolutions.
Honorable Member for St. Andrew Northeast.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to move for the adoption of the following resolution standing in my name. Whereas, control of the state of Grenada was disputed by Great Britain and France in the 18th century, with Britain ultimately prevailing with the Treaty of Versailles on the 3rd September 1983. And whereas, under the Associated Statehood Act, on the 3rd March 1967, Grenada was granted full autonomy over its internal affairs. And whereas, on 7th February 1974, Grenada became a fully independent state and continued to practice a modified Westminster parliamentary system based on the British model, with a Governor-General appointed by the representing the British monarch, and a Prime Minister who is both the leader of the majority party and the head of government. And whereas independence means a condition of a nation, country or state in which its residents and population or some portion thereof exercise self-government and usually sovereignty over the territory. Be it resolved that the political, economic, social, and other benefits from being an independent nation far outweighs the dependency on a monarchy. Mr. Speaker, there is a famous Chinese proverb which reads, and I quote, "The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single footstep." End of quote. Mr. Speaker, forgive me, for I may become emotional when I reflect on what our nation has been through to the journey of independence. From being occupied by the Arawaks, from the Arawaks being chased by the Kalinagos, from the arrivals of Columbus and other European settlers. Mr. Speaker, 7 long years of being pulled like a game of tug of war between the French and the British. Mr. Speaker, I can go on, but I will compose myself and move on with the rest of my presentation. For it's not my intention to stand in this honorable house this morning and give a history lesson, but it's imperative that I give such vital information as I stand resolute with my esteemed colleagues on the motion being presented here today. Mr. Speaker, the political, economic, social, and other benefits being under the monarchy far outweighs being, if I can take that the political, economic, social, and other benefits being an independent nation far outweighs being under the monarchy. Mr. Speaker, being under colonization, we would have had to deal with small allowances made for us by our colonizers. But given full autonomy of our state, we can negotiate and get greater funding for all our developmental sectors. Mr. Speaker, the government, the opposition may argue that we would have not made progress and our journey to independence was futile. But Mr. Speaker, Grenada's journey to independence can be compared to a child who has gone from foster home to foster home. That child may have been abused, marginalized, and deceived, but have managed to make advances despite of the many challenges. Mr. Speaker, the opposition would say the progress that we would have made is insignificant. But as my grandmother always said, and I quote, one cocoa, always fill a basket. Mr. Speaker, you have to take time when you are dealing with important matters. Mr. Speaker, I stand here in the capacity as Minister responsible for education. And I am proud to say that as a government and as a nation, we would have made significant progress over the years. Mr. Speaker, there have been increase in our institutions. We have gone from 20 secondary schools to 20. Mr. Speaker, our preschool and our daycare, we would have went from 75 in the 1980s to 105 in the 2000s. Mr. Speaker, as an independent nation, we now have bigger allocations towards our education system here in Grenada. We now have more scholarships. In the year 2018 alone, we had 173 scholarships being available for our citizens. Mr. Speaker, we have the school feeding program and other initiatives, and there's more to come, Mr. Speaker, because we have full autonomy of our nation, and we can definitely negotiate for bigger and better development and benefits for our nation. Mr. Speaker, if I may comment, we have made increase in our vocational and technical studies. As a nation, we were able to provide aid to Tortola, Anguilla, and other nations that was ravished by Hurricane Maria in 2018.
Honorable Member, your time has ended.
Mr.
Please.
Speaker, I beg your indulgence for 1 more minute.
You have 35 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, as we continue to develop as a nation, we are not oblivious of the fact that we may face many challenges, but it was evident during Hurricane Ivan and Emily that we are resilient and hard-working people. And as we grow from strength to strength, we can definitely make this nation what it ought to be. if I'm allowed to quote one of our famous independence songs. Hand in hand for a better land, that's business, brighter out of darkness. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The question proposed is that, whereas control of the state of Grenada was disputed by Great Britain and France in the 18th century, with the British ultimately prevailing with the Treaty of Versailles on the 3rd September 1783, and whereas under the Associated Statehood Act on the 3rd March 1967, Grenada was granted full autonomy over its internal affairs. And whereas on the 7th February 1974, Grenada became a fully independent state and continued to practice a modified Westminster parliamentary system based on the British model, with a Governor-General appointed by and representing the British monarch, and a Prime Minister who is both leader of the majority party and the head of government. And whereas independence means a condition of a nation, country, or state in which its residents and population, or some portion thereof, exercise self-government and usually sovereignty over the territory. Be it resolved that the political, economic, social, and other benefits for being an independent nation far outweighs the dependency of a monarchy. Are there any other contributions to the motion?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to second the motion. The 7th of February 1974.
Honorable Member, I have not acknowledged you quite yet. Please have your seat.
Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Member for Carriacou and Petit Martinique and Minister for Carriacou and Petit Martinique Affairs and Legal Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to second the motion. The 7th of February 1974. What a beautiful date that I'm sure we're all aware of. As Grenadians, we were taught that this is the day we were afforded independence. But Mr. Speaker, many of us don't know that that is not the only thing that we got on that date. Mr. Speaker, on this day, we were given a written constitution. For those of us unaware, Mr. Speaker, a written constitution is important because it protects individual freedom and its fundamental principles govern the country, and it places the government's power in the hands of the citizens. Mr. Speaker, it limits the power of the government and establishes a system of checks and balances. Balance, Mr. Speaker, something so crucial to the effective running of an economy. Mr. Speaker, within this constitution, all the fundamental rights and freedoms that Grenadians are guaranteed are stated in a manner clearly to follow, Mr. Speaker. For example, Chapter 1 of the Constitution, particularly Sections 1 through 13, all state the rights and freedoms we are afforded, such as the rights to life, security, expression, and freedom, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Constitution allows for the people of a country to have a say, feel safe, and have a sense of belonging. Mr. Speaker, a country's wealth is its people. Happy people are progressive people, therefore the country moves forward. Mr. Speaker, with proper legislation, our country can also reap the economic benefits of being independent. For example, the Bahamas has experienced continued economic growth since its independence from Britain in 1973, and it was seen that since gaining independence between the years of 1973 to 1986,
Honorable Member for St. Patrick East.
Mr. Speaker, I stand on a point of order.
Please state.
Mr. Speaker, it seems like the Minister for Carriacou and Petit Martinique Affairs is breaching the rules of the House, and she is reading.
Thank you very much. Honorable Member for Carriacou and Petit Martinique, I would like you to refrain from reading.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are well aware of independent nations with unsuccessful economies. But according to a survey published in the Economic Consequences of Political Independence, and I quote, "The economic performance of recently independent countries depends on the economic policies adopted by the government and the degree of political tranquility fostered in the country," end quote. Mr. Speaker, in conjunction, James Ahipor, a widely published economist, wrote, and let me quote again, that those who hold power may determine the amount and extent...
Honorable member, I have noticed that you continue to read. If it is so your desire, you should ask permission to read in the House.
Mr. Speaker, permit me to read a quote.
Proceed.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, and as I was quoting, those who hold power may determine the amount and extent of taxation, regulation of enterprises, commerce, and the rights of individuals to own property, end quote. Mr. Speaker, for a nation, the ability to exercise political control without seeking the approval of foreign bodies is a freedom of fundamental importance. Mr. Speaker, according to Greek philosophers such as Aristotle, the term politics was derived from the Greek word polis, meaning state. Mr. Speaker, it is our state. We are present within the state, feeling the economic, social, and political pressures, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, thus, there is no one better to make, Mr. Speaker, there is no one better suited to make progressive decisions about said economy, Mr. Speaker, and independence affords us that right. Mr. Speaker, as I conclude, I would like to remind us that political independence is a matter of birthright. Mr. Speaker, in the words of Lester Bird, former Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, and permit me to read the quote, Mr. Speaker, "To be free is our right. To be independent is our absolute right," end quote. Mr. Speaker, my colleagues and I are well aware that the road to a fully sustainable economic country is a tedious one and has been and will be filled with road bumps. But, Mr. Speaker, achieving anything of such value is not easy, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, although our steps may be small, we need to remember... Mr. Speaker, permit me 30 seconds to wrap up my speech, please.
Honorable member, do so in 20 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I was saying, our steps may be small, but we need to remember that small steps still move us forward, Mr. Speaker. And as our Minister for Finance would explain, we have been moving forward since 1974. Mr. Speaker, even Rome wasn't built in a day. I think it would be unreasonable for us to expect Grenada to be. I thank you.
Are there any other contributions to the motion? Honorable member for the town of St. George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start off by defining the word monarchy. Permit me to quote, please, Mr. Speaker. According to the Oxford Dictionary, monarchy can be defined as a form of government with a sovereign head of state, especially a king or empire at the head. With that being said, Mr. Speaker, the monarchy, where we carry their laws, their social practices, education system, and most of all, the laws, especially the labor acts, must I state, Mr. Speaker. I took my time and I researched and I read many, many articles. And it came to my surprise that the members of the colonies actually enjoys being under the colonization, because the laws and their rights are far more than ours.
Honorable member, do you have any such articles or books to support
Yes, I
your
do,
statement?
Mr. Speaker.
Can you name at least one or two?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. According to BringCanada.com, the UK Labour Protection, which they have under the colonies, they have rights to equal pay for public and public, They also have rights to breastfeeding breaks. They have rights to rest period separate from lunch and breaks. They also have rights to Christmas bonus, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they also have rights to consistent labor training. And with that training, they also get a raise of pay. Must I say, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, they also have rights to religious accommodation, which we don't have here in Grenada. And that is a great, big concern. It has way more significance than we might lay on to. Because there are people that are trained in certain fields and would love to work in certain fields, but they cannot attain that job simply because they are Seventh-day Adventists. And that breaks their spirits and their work ethics, must I state, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the colonizers take labor training to be a priority. With that being said, this will develop the productivity and the efficiency of our products here in Grenada. Also, colonizers, they believe that in order to hold power to the colonies, they have to develop the country in somewhat way, especially industrially. This means they are expanding businesses within a certain industry or creating new businesses in certain industries, which will in turn, with the aim to reduce unemployment and also to increase the country economically. I have, according to the British Virgin Islands, which is partially still under the monarchy, I have looked at the unemployment rate, and it is 5.9%. British Columbia, the unemployment rate is below 1% and has been decreasing consistently. Mr. Speaker, I am not saying that we hadn't had a hard road to independence. I'm not saying that we haven't reached anywhere from 1974 to now. But what I am saying is that we can depend on the colonies in somewhat way to help us, not fully, but just to help us, just a little, because we do need assistance, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
I would like the members of this honorable house to refrain from clapping. Are there any other contributions to the motion? Honorable Member for St. David and Minister of Tourism, Culture and Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are all Grenadians. Mr. Speaker, we all live here. So tell me, why on earth should we allow ourselves to be governed and decisions made on our behalf by another body? Mr. Speaker, we know best. We know our own struggles and we know what's best for us. We are the living truth. Mr. Speaker, for every word that comes out of the mouth of the opposition opposing independence, I can assure you that Sir Eric Matthew Geary is turning in his grave. Let us examine today what independence means to us and what it was like before independence. Mr. Speaker, our independence has allowed us our own independent vote at the United Nations. We vote on matters that concern us as a people. Mr. Speaker, allow me to stray for a bit. As I sat here, and I must say this is a very nice Parliament building, very modern. And as I looked up, I couldn't help but think that this design looks much like a boat. Mr. Speaker, allow me to drop it into these waters and pack the opposition on board because clearly they still have a slavery mentality. I cannot imagine why we should be settling for less now like we did back in those days. Mr. Speaker, look at the relationships we built with other nations as an independent nation. We have funding flexibility with countries like China. As our education minister pointed out, look at the number of scholarships we have received. And as our minister for housing would exclaim, look at the number of housing projects we have going on, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we decided to allow this. We both enjoy mutual benefits from such agreements. And the opposition should not even start to talk about this being a dependency. Mr. Speaker, show me who has done it alone. The great United States of America has allies and are in constant trade negotiations to get the best deal for their people. So, Mr. Speaker, this point is out the door. Mr. Speaker, as Minister for Tourism.
Honourable Member for South St. George.
Mr. Speaker, I stand on a point of order.
Please state.
Mr. Speaker, through you, the honourable member is using her hand gestures, which I feel very threatened by, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member, I would like you to contain your hand movements as to allow every member to feel comfortable and safe in this honourable house.
No problem, Mr. Speaker. I'm
Please
a bit
continue.
emotional about this. As Minister for Tourism, I can boast about how we turned our identity into profits. I know this for a fact. Mr. Speaker, we have a vibrant tourism sector. Tourist arrivals alone increased by 8% in 2017 as compared to 2016. And yet again, Mr. Speaker, in 2018, we had over 500,000 tourist arrivals. We must be doing something special. Mr. Speaker, look at how we developed our sites. Our patriotism speaks volume. Visitors aren't coming here to see no Buckingham Palace. They're looking for something traditional, something this independent island created. Mr. Speaker, Carnival, Juve, Jab Jab, it's these things we gave a Grenadian feel. Mr. Speaker, when the anthem is being played, I know for a fact the opposition looks patriotic and proud. Mr. Speaker, in primary school, we were all excited about Leptotila walsi, our national bird. Mr. Speaker, I know somebody in that opposition that enjoys a good plate of oil, our national dish. Mr. Speaker, the opposition is misguided. They hate what they like. This independence spoke to us on so many levels, developing our brand as the Isle of Spice and further to pure Grenada. Mr. Speaker, I don't know about you, but I am proud. Proud to be Grenadian, but I'm not too sure about the opposition. According to Sharp, Mr. Speaker, allow me to quote, in an article published by Petri Utopia, non-self-governing territories have little to no control over the present or their future. He went on to say these territories act as offshore financial centers for such lucrative countries and are far too economically useful to relinquish and to be made independent, end of quote. Colonialism, Mr. Speaker, the milking continues. Bermuda, Cayman Islands, countries with high per capita and high GDPs. Mr. Speaker, trust me, you don't want to miss the end of this speech. I beg for 1 minute. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
In 30 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, countries like these that feed directly into their colonial masters, Mr. Speaker, and all they get is second-class citizenship. Mr. Speaker, as the great Robert Nesta Marley once said, emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. But as I look across the aisle, Mr. Speaker, it is evident this message was not well received. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member, I was going to allow you more time to continue singing, but as soon as you stopped, I wouldn't have permitted you any more time. Honourable Member for St. David West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a nation's health is its wealth. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I would like to examine our current health sector in Grenada. According to Pan American Health Organization 2015, and I quote, the health sector in Grenada operates with outdated legislation and regulations. The Public Health Act, for example, dates to 1958. This obsolescence hinders operations such as the compliance with commitments as the international health regulations. End of quote. Mr. Speaker, there are many cries of concern among our Grenadian people in terms of the health sector and the environment. Mr. Speaker, I feel very disturbed standing here as I often listen to the words of my Grenadian people. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, so many times we see our Grenadian people hosting motorcades, going around with donation sheets so that they could raise funding for themselves and a loved one to go overseas because our healthcare system does not have the means of performing certain operations in this country, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, according to Dr. Brian J.M. Joseph, on July 1st, 2017, and I quote, conditions in the General Hospital have become so deplorable that the indignity is sickening. Mr. Speaker, he went on to say that conditions are fairly poor and the lack of medication is an ongoing problem. End of quote. Mr. Speaker, I would like to enlighten the government here today about the benefits that we would receive under the monarchy. Mr. Speaker, Britain currently helps the territories to fulfill international responsibilities, which they have signed up under, such as international health regulations. They also help them to be better prepared for emergencies and to be able to manage them effectively. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, over the years in these territories, progress has been made in improving maternal and child health. Mr. Speaker, I love this part here. All pregnant women receive antenatal care by trained healthcare workers. Not one, not half, not three-quarters, Mr. Speaker, but all. Infant mortality rates continue to decline, Mr. Speaker, and in Anguilla, under retroviral therapy is provided free of charge. According to the article, Health and Healthcare in the British Overseas Territory, Regional and UK Government Support 2010, and I quote, Britain's overarching objective for its engagement with the territories on health matters is to improve global health and to meet the UK's international obligation, end of quote. Mr. Speaker, some people refer to Martinique as being très magnifique. Mr. Speaker, Martinique is a French overseas territory, and Martinique residents, they enjoy the same healthcare system as people in France. Mr. Speaker, why would our country Grenada's healthcare system be regarded as très magnifique? Mr. Speaker, under Martinique's medical system, France has a responsibility for general public health, including community-wide disease prevention, sanitation surveillance, border health control, and the control of major diseases and drug and alcohol addiction. Mr. Speaker, France also oversees the training of health personnel. It helps define the conditions of work. Mr. Speaker, I think I've said enough. And as I summarize, I am like a voice crying out in the wilderness for my Grenadian people, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleading for the sake of my people. Mr. Speaker, I would like the government to understand that, indeed, a healthy nation is a wealthy nation. But in order for us to be a healthy, a wealthy, and a happy nation, permission granted to have 15 seconds to conclude, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable member, you're granting yourself permission or
sorry, Mr. Speaker, may I have 15 seconds to conclude?
Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in summary, as I was saying, a healthy nation is a wealthy nation. In order for us to be healthy, happy, and wealthy, we need to reevaluate this situation, Mr. Speaker. Under the monarchy, we would have so many benefits. Myself and my worthy panel here, Mr. Speaker, we've come today and we stand firm, Mr. Speaker, in our stance against this resolution. I thank you.
Before we proceed, I would like to let the honorable members know that this is not the grounds for the audition of the Tivoli drummers. The noise is becoming disturbing, and so to allow the fair speech of all members, I'm asking that you contain yourselves, please. Are there any other contributions to the motion? Honorable Member for St. John West and Minister of Health and Social Security.
Mr. Speaker,
I'll begin with this famous quote from Edward Everett Hale, and I quote, "Coming together is a beginning. Keeping together is progress. Working together is success," unquote. With that being said, there has been an overall growth in the health sector and also an increase in social benefits since independence. Firstly, Mr. Speaker, I'll make reference to the establishment of our national insurance scheme, brought about due to our independence, and it has provided numerous services and social security benefits for over 35 years. In relation to housing, 12 housing work brigades were constituted throughout the Tri-Island State, bringing along 180 new jobs. Not forgetting the low-income housing projects, the different housing schemes, and the numerous housing assistance given to citizens over the years. Comparing to life in the monarchy times, many used to live in Janet houses. Now, Mr. Speaker, you have to scrunt today to find one Janet house. Coming to the highlight of my presentation, the health sector. Firstly, I'm not going to attempt to bamboozle this honorable house into thinking we have a perfect health system when that is not the case. Yes, there are some challenges, but we, the government, have made allocations in our 2019 budget to alleviate some of these issues, beginning with the improvement in the physical structure of 36 different health facilities throughout the Tri-Island State. Furthermore, right now the Princess Alice Hospital is recognized as a smart healthcare facility, and this is a milestone worth applauding, as 69% of our health infrastructure were affected by Hurricanes Ivan and Emily. Also, through the 11th EDF Health Sector Budget Support, $7.4 million was donated to establish a state-of-the-art polyclinic in Wharf. Members of the opposition, you should take a visit. I'm sure you'll be impressed. Also, the technological capacity of the General Hospital was improved in 2010 by the installation of a new Alcon Vision system costing US $600,000 and a new surgical C-arm equipment and X-ray intensifier costing US $85,000. Back in the 1960s, 70s, what we know about that? According to an assessment in 2012, profiling Grenada by the Pan-American Organization titled Health in the Americas, it was stated that all health and medical stations in Grenada provides maternal and reproductive health care. Furthermore, there were 9,054 live births in the period 2006 to 2010, and 99% of them took place at our hospital and birthing centers. This is a vast improvement, seen as back in the monarchical times, many births took place at home. Continuing, the country has maintained 100% immunization coverage of vaccine-preventable diseases in infants under the age of 1 and had no reported case of measles between the period 1991 to 2010. Isn't that spectacular? According to the FAO, Nutrition Country Profiles on page 13, subtitled Anthropometric Data, states that a study done by Miguel Guerri among children 0 to 5 years showed that in 1975, 39.7% were malnourished, whereas in 1997, it dropped significantly to 4.3%, and furthermore decreased in 1998 to 2.8%. This showed that malnutrition was not as severe in the 90s as it was in the 70s. Last but not least, independence. Because of independence, there is now a Ministry of Health and other different ministries present to govern and overly improve different sectors of this country. Without independence, we wouldn't be in this position here today. We wouldn't be having this debate right now. So members of the opposition, let's break the shackles of colonialism. Let's dance to a future of continued progress, embracing change, stability, and most of all, good health. I thank you.
And John East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I listened to the Honorable Member of St. Andrews Northeast, as she spoke about the slow development of independence in which she compared Grenada to a child, who is suffering from abuse, I was a little bit baffled. Mr. Speaker, in my opinion, it seems that the deficiency is even more than abuse. Maybe it's Down syndrome or autism. I really don't know. It is a historical fact, Mr. Speaker, that Grenada was disputed by Great Britain and France in the 18th century. Britain, however, prevailed under the Treaty of Versailles, Mr. Speaker, in which Grenada decided to fight for our own independence. Countries such as Martinique and Guadeloupe remained with the monarch of France, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure if it was a situation of monkey see, monkey do, or our leaders were thinking about the psychological, social, economic, and financial implications of their decision. Now, Mr. Speaker, I will come back to that so-called independence that we received, but I would like to compare the development of the countries that remained with France and the development of Grenada. According to an in-depth research conducted in Guadeloupe by Jean Lacarte, Mr. Speaker, she found that 81.9% of the working population were qualified with a university degree. This, Mr. Speaker, was backed by the technological advancement. I cannot say the same for Grenada. What's interesting, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that Britain today ranks higher in terms of technological development as compared to France. Instead, Mr. Speaker, what we face is a number of external expenses in which we must maintain diplomatic corps, pay membership dues, and in most instances, the fees in which we pay, the currency in which we pay, is much higher than our own. These are money, Mr. Speaker, we could have used for our own development, in which members of this beloved Grenada, Carriacou, and Petite Martinique would have had more disposable income and a better quality of life. Mr. Speaker, the members on the government side will try to convince you, they may even try to convince us, that being an independent state far outweighs the benefit of being under the monarchy. But the question is, are we truly independent? And to what extent are we independent if the monarchy still appoints the head of state? A position, Mr. Speaker, if we were independent, that should have been, in my opinion, elected. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I would like to take a closer look at countries that remain under the monarchy of Great Britain. Countries such as the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. And according to a research conducted by the Statistics Office, it showed, Mr. Speaker, when comparing their purchasing parity power, that the Cayman Islands total an amount of $69,500 US.
Honorable Member, the Statistics Office of
Cayman Islands. Sorry, Mr. Speaker. The statistic, according Cayman Island, total amount of $69,500 US, whilst the British Virgin Islands, total amount of $49,400 US, and Grenada, Mr. Speaker, a mere $12,300 US. The facts are right there before us. The bigger question, Mr. Speaker, is, are we really independent? Mr. Speaker, we are seeing the birth of a new monarch in this 21st century. Mr. Speaker, our return is China, 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 China. Mr. Speaker, it is the same tune. The only difference in this case, Mr. Speaker, it is played by a different piper. I say all this to say, Mr. Speaker, and just to draw a few examples, I will look at the programs that we are being offered by China in terms of education, economic development, also the development of our infrastructure. I say that to say, Mr. Speaker, if we are so dependent on other countries for our development, we should have just remained under the monarchy. And I know the honorable members on the government side will say that no country is 100% independent. But Mr. Speaker, at what cost are we getting aid from these outside countries? I leave this question for the members on the government side to ponder. I thank you.
Honorable Member for St. George Northwest, Prime Minister, Minister for Finance and National Security and Climate Resilience.
Mr. Speaker, good morning. Good morning to this honorable House. Mr. Speaker, the honorable member who just spoke asked a question. Are we independent? Permit me to answer that question, Mr. Speaker.
Proceed.
Yes, we are. Mr. Speaker, allow me to begin by quoting British writer and theologian Clive Staple Lewis, commonly known as C.S. Lewis. He said, and I quote, "You cannot go back and change the beginning, but you can start from where you are."
Honorable Member for St. John East.
Mr. Speaker, I stand on a point of clarity.
Please state.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I would like to clear a statement made by our Honorable Prime Minister. The question that I asked was not, are we independent? The question was, are we fully independent? And if we are fully independent, why do we depend on the monarch to appoint a head of state? Thank you.
Honorable Member for St. George Northwest and Prime Minister, do you wish to clarify?
I will clarify later on in my presentation, Mr. Speaker.
Proceed.
Mr. Speaker, as an independent state, Grenada now has full control over its internal and external affairs. That is, economically, politically, socially, and otherwise. And as a result of that, Mr. Speaker, Grenada can and will place its efforts and resources on the development of the state and its people. Mr. Speaker, before the establishment of the Associated Statehood Act of 1967, which gave us little or no control over our actual internal affairs, Grenada's sole purpose to the British Empire was development. Not development to Grenada, but to the British Empire. Allow me to clarify, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, M.A.I.E. Jeffrey, expert in public policy in the Department of Public Administration at the University of Nigeria, defined dependency as a historic condition which shapes a certain structure of the world economy such that it favors some countries to the detriment of others. Mr. Speaker, from the point of our interaction with the indigenous people, to the importation of slaves to our shores, to the point of us gaining independence, all we did was empower the British monarch. Mr. Speaker, the honorable member asked me to clarify. Allow me to clarify. As a result of our independence, Mr. Speaker, we have the right to establish bilateral relations and diplomatic relations with any country, any sovereign nation of our choosing. As it stands now, Mr. Speaker, Grenada has established bilateral relations with more than 30 governments around the globe, including that of the People's Republic of China, the Russian Federation, Mexico, Costa Rica, the Republic of France, the Republic of Chile, the Republic of Kazakhstan, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, Japan, the Kingdom of Morocco, the Federative Republic of Brazil. These relations have brought significant social and economic benefits to the people of this country, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Social Development will examine some of those social benefits in her presentation. Mr. Speaker, Grenada's economy has been on a constant path of economic expansion since 2013 and has experienced its 6th consecutive year of growth in 2018. Economic growth of 5.2% in real terms was estimated for that year. That was fueled by expansions in construction, tourism, transportation.
Honorable Member, I have recognized that you are reading. You did not ask permission to do so, so please refrain from that.
Mr. Speaker, I'm simply referring to my notes.
Without reading, please.
Mr. Speaker, allow me to make reference to the Paris Climate Agreement. The Paris Agreement was established within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, dealing with the greenhouse emission. Grenada is one of 195 states to have signed on to that agreement, Mr. Speaker. Notably, Puerto Rico is not a part of that agreement, Mr. Speaker. However, the country to which it has its association, the United States, is now pulling out from that agreement. In 2017, Mr. Speaker, Puerto Rico was ravished by a severe hurricane, Mr. Speaker. In 2004, Grenada experienced the same fate. Mr. Speaker, throughout the region, Grenada is commended for its fast recovery and remarkable development after Hurricane Ivan. This is highly significant, Mr. Speaker. This would not have been evident if we were not an independent state. Look at Puerto Rico. They are still trying to recover. At this point in time, Mr. Speaker, the United States of America is going through the longest government shutdown in its history. And the President is now considering taking funds from the Hurricane Relief Fund that is meant for Puerto Rico to build a wall. Mr. Speaker, we do not have to endure that fate. Thanks to our independence, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the honourable member made reference to the fact that the monarch... Mr. Speaker, I beg of you for 30 seconds to summarize.
25 seconds is granted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the honourable member made reference to the British monarch choosing our head of state. Mr. Speaker, that in itself is a reflection of our independence. What do I mean by this, Mr. Speaker? We have the right to choose. We decided, Mr. Speaker, to stick with this system of government, Mr. Speaker. And my Minister for Legal Affairs didn't mention this, Mr. Speaker, but the referendum held in Grenada in 2016 and 2018, was a true reflection of our independence. We chose, Mr. Speaker, the people of this country chose to remain with the Privy Council. We have a choice. They chose to remain with the Privy Council. If we were still under the British monarch, that would not have been a choice. Mr. Speaker, I thank you.
Honourable Member for St. George Northeast.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to tell the Minister of Tourism on the government side that where wisdom stops, boasting begins. No man is an island, no man stands alone. Mr. Speaker, in an era of globalization, where international trade is evident and economic integration is key, why are we still using the word independence? Mr. Speaker, according to Amartya Sen, permit me to quote Mr. Speaker, source development as Freedom 2001, Oxford University Press. Development is about creating freedom for people and removing obstacles to greater freedom, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, freedom enables people to choose their own destiny, Mr. Speaker. Obstacles to remove and hinge to development includes poverty, lack of economic opportunities, corruption, poor governance, lack of education, and lack of healthcare, which is evident in this country, Mr. Speaker. End of quote. Mr. Speaker, the economic development of Grenada is based on exogenous growth, Mr. Speaker. I thought when you're independent, you're supposed to depend on yourself, which is endogenous growth, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't know what the Prime Minister is saying. I'm a bit confused. Mr. Speaker, under the monarchy, we will have greater access to technology and innovation since the UK have power and dominance in that field, Mr. Speaker. If we are still under the rule of Britain, Grenada will have improved access to education, healthcare, which will improve the health of our citizens, equip our workforce, would lead to creative thinking, healthcare development, manufacturing, transportation, and increasing agricultural output. Can we see the bigger picture? If it was under the monarch, the amount of money that will be allotted to our economy, Mr. Speaker, permit me to use an example. Our budget for 2019 is $1.12 billion, Mr. Speaker. If we were still under the British colony, Mr. Speaker, and we added, and the British colony added $180 billion to that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let us think of the economic spin-off that would have happened, Mr. Speaker. The high-paid jobs, the high-qualified workforce we will have, the increase in per capita income of individuals, which in turn increase the country's GDP. We'll have a reduction in poverty, Mr. Speaker, infrastructure, and an improved standard of living. Mr. Speaker, Grenada would have been far ahead of other countries while the other countries still at the train station receiving gas, Mr. Speaker, to fuel themselves to economic development, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, economic partnership agreement, we would have not had to go down that road if it was under the Queen, Mr. Speaker. Grenada was one of the countries in 1995 that was enabled by the World Trade Organization through a forum of negotiation, which eventually led to an economic partnership with CARICOM countries called CARIFORM, Mr. Speaker. This would have not been necessary under the monarchy, Mr. Speaker, because the monarchy signed, the UK signed onto a Lomé Convention in 1997, in which Grenada would have had automatic privilege to trade in, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we keep going down and going down and going down when we could have the development right there, in which we could have tapped into the creative industry and provide avenues for our artists, our calypsonians, Mr. Speaker, which will in turn have foreign exchange, employment, tourism. Look at what reggae and Bob Marley has done for Jamaica, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we will have a diverse economy, Mr. Speaker, in which we will reduce the vulnerability of a single industry, in which the Minister of Tourism keeps speaking about tourism, sun, sea, and sand, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government is speaking and they just keep doing the opposite of what independence truly means. Mr. Speaker, when all is said and done, I would like the government to understand that we are, under the monarchy, we would have many benefits, which will lead to low inflation, increasing GDP and economic development by economic growth, Mr. Speaker, in which the Prime Minister is so solely speaking about, Mr. Speaker. We'll have a favorable balance of payment, which will reduce our current account deficit, because, Mr. Speaker, example like Martinique and Guadeloupe, who is still under colonial, but they still have high mountain debt, Mr. Speaker, but they still have trade deficits, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there is nothing to say to that, but we will have a greater development and increased foreign exchange or in reducing poverty, which will lead to reduced growth, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, he who cannot put his thoughts on I should not enter into the heat of a dispute, Mr. Prime Minister. If your shoes too big for your foot, you don't wear it. You find your size. Mr. Speaker, I believe the government is suffering from not a custom. I implore on the government, if your shoes is too big, get your size. Mr. Speaker, would have been
Honorable member for St. Andrew North East.
Mr. Speaker, I stand on a point of order.
Please state.
I'm not too sure if I would have heard correctly, but did the opposition, the member on the other side, refer to the Prime Minister directly?
Thank you very much. I did make notice of that, honorable member. You know that we have to preserve the decorum of this house, and that is not of the standards of this house. Please adhere to the decorum
Mr.
of this
Speaker,
house.
I'll adhere as I conclude. I would like to implore on the government to be a bit more firm in their stance and do a lot of research because it's evident that they are coming here with fallacious arguments that is not even in the context or the current construct of what they are speaking about. Mr. Speaker, if you don't have the testicular fortitude to lead this nation to development, Mr. Speaker, let's transfer seat and let me show you how it's done, Mr. Speaker, because I believe they're just not into the whole liking of what economic development is, Mr. Speaker. They keep talking about economic growth, Mr. Speaker. You could have all the economic growth but no development, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg for 30 seconds to wrap up.
Honorable member, you have 30 seconds.
You see, when you're speaking, good thing the speaker does want you to listen carefully and just understand. Mr. Speaker, I firmly believe that if we would have been more advanced under the monarch, if we were still under there, Mr. Speaker, we would have been far way than our Caribbean nations, Mr. Speaker. And I think that we can't even rethink it. But I think they should take a page of Martinique, Guadeloupe, the Cayman Islands, and the British Virgin Islands, Mr. Speaker. I thank you.
Honorable member for St. Andrew Southwest and Minister for Labor and Works.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in this honorable house today as the sixth batsman on our team to help drive our point home. Mr. Speaker, as the Minister of Labor and Works, permit me to take us a trip down memory lane, a painful but yet necessary process. Under our previous monarchy, before our independence, this tri-island state was in strict poverty, possessed a high illiteracy rate. Persons worked for very low wages. No one had the opportunity to own lands except he or she was wealthy, and most unfortunately, the monarch was insensitive to the plight of workers. Mr. Speaker, this same monarch rallied against our fight for better wages, holiday and sick leave with pay, pension and paid maternity leaves. Mr. Speaker, speak about progress. Did you know that even Grenada now has a paid maternity leave and the almighty independent US doesn't? This same independent model owes billions of dollars in debt to China, Mr. Speaker. They rely heavily on trade. The world is an open market. Hence, Mr. Speaker, this goes to show that independence does not mean that we don't rely on outside assistance, because these said outside assistances helps us to form relationships that help us to better our economy and our society on a whole. Mr. Speaker, independence and democracy goes hand in hand. And in this capacity, it means a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Simply put, we the people get to decide who runs our country. And this is what Grenada has. Isn't this progress? Mr. Speaker, we stand here proud to say that we no longer need to burn down buildings or estates because our ministries of labor and work do not pose insensitive to the plight of workers. Instead, they try to find reasonable negotiations that benefit both the workers and our society on a whole. Mr. Speaker, we have employed so much more individuals than our monarch would have allowed, paid much better wages. We organized agricultural, road, and domestic workers, provided holidays and sick leave with pay, and even double wages for workers who work on public holidays. The unprecedented amount that has been spent on workers, Mr. Speaker, has not even been considered since back then. It has come to be so beneficial, Mr. Speaker, that workers can even travel to study and come back with their job intact. Mr. Speaker, our human resource is now dripping in finesse. Further, we see that roads that were considered shortcuts are now well-paved roads, Mr. Speaker. When investors come to a country, they look at the roads and the public utilities. Mr. Speaker, look at how many investors have come to seek Grenada's hand in marriage because of our improvement in the work sector. Can we honestly say, with a good conscience, that we were way better back then than we are today? Currently, we look at monarchies such as Saudi Arabia, and Mr. Speaker, we say thank God for independence. Though we can honestly acknowledge that we are not where we want to be as yet. Because independence is not just a day, but it is a process, Mr. Speaker. The many benefits that have stemmed from our labor and work sectors upon our independence are numerous. Think of Saudi Arabia, where there are no legal provisions to form or join any independent unions in the country, as there are currently no labor unions in the country, Mr. Speaker. In Grenada, we have formed TAU, PW, and GUT that has developed so tremendously over the years.
Honorable Member for St. Patrick East.
Mr. Speaker, I stand on a point of clarity.
Please state.
Mr. Speaker, through you, I would like to ask the Minister for St. Patrick's West if she can clarify him. She made a statement, improvement in the work sector. Now, I would like for her to clarify it a little more for me, or to provide some sort of evidence that there is improvement in the work sector now.
Honorable Member, I know that her clarity isn't as clear as she would have liked to bring it across, but do you wish to clarify?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think my statement is pretty clear enough, and I would not like to clarify that statement.
Proceed.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, in Grenada, we have from TAWU, PW, and GUT that has developed so tremendously over the years. We have these unions to fight for us at present, Mr. Speaker. These other countries don't even have these unions to fight for domestic workers or better working conditions for their future. Mr. Speaker, we say thank you, Jesus, for the blood that was shed that has caused us to be where we are today. We have not arrived as yet. Rome wasn't built in a day. But it is without a doubt that the benefits of being this independent nation in regards to labor and work far outweighs us being under a monarchy. I thank you.
Thank you, honorable members. When you stand on a point of clarity, please be clear on what you're standing on. Are there any other contributions to the motion? Honorable Member for South St. George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will not doubt the fact that we are an independent country. Being fully independent, being a fully independent country, Mr. Speaker, that I am not certain about. Mr. Speaker, being under the monarchy gives us full British citizenship, which can allow us visa-free entry to many countries, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can remember in the year 2014 when I had applied for my U.S. visa and I had to travel to the U.S. Embassy in Barbados at the cost of $836 for air fees round trip, plus hotel fees included, which might have added up to approximately $2,000. Mr. Speaker, to make a long story short.
Honorable Member, 2,000 TT, 2,000 Guyanese, Chinese, what currency are you referring to?
U.S. dollars, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Speaker, to make a long story short, I went on the interview and awaited my results, only for the officer to say to me in a sad tone, and permit me to quote, please, Mr. Speaker. Ms. Jeremiah, I am sorry to tell you that your visa is denied due to not having enough information, unquote, Mr. Speaker. Tears came down my eyes, not for the fact that I was denied the visa, Mr. Speaker, but when I thought of all the money I had spent to go on that appointment, Mr. Speaker, it hurt my feelings. Mr. Speaker, I am saying all this to say that if we were under the monarchy, the people of this beautiful country would not have to go through all these heartbreaking experiences, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, having a British passport gives us cheaper and easier access to the U.S., where many of us have families and friends. The argument has been made by scholars, although it is not a very popular argument, Mr. Speaker, but the truth is the truth, that many countries were better off as colonies. In fact, it has been said that the United Kingdom was one of the better colonial powers for the stability which they brought to colonial rule. If we were to examine the history of some former colonies, we will see, for example, that many are worse off economically, politically, socially, now than they were under the monarchy.
Honorable Member and honorable members of this House, if it is that your nerves are demanding that you read. Permission to read must be granted by the Speaker of the House. So I am asking each member, you know how nervous you may be at the beginning of your speech, please request permission to read. Honorable member, proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if we were to examine the history of some former colonies, we will see, for example, that many are worse off economically, politically, and socially, now than they were under the monarchy, Mr. Speaker. Many countries in Africa, for example, have never experienced political stability like they did under the monarchy. Here in the Caribbean, Mr. Speaker, it has been said that the countries that have remained under the monarchy are better off economically, especially, Mr. Speaker, than those of us that gained our independence. Examples such as Anguilla, the British Virgin Islands, and others have shown tremendous economic growth because they have a monarch, a motherland that still looks out for them, Mr. Speaker. In the aftermath of disasters, for example, and we know that the region is prone to disaster, Mr. Speaker, if countries such as Grenada and Dominica had the monarch to assist them, recovery periods would likely be shorter due to the direct aid of benefactors. As I conclude, Mr. Speaker, I know that there are many arguments against colonial rule and the monarchy for the psychological and other horrors that the colonies experienced. And those have been touted time and again, but we have seen places where the monarch works, Mr. Speaker, and when it works, Mr. Speaker, it works well. Is it no wonder then that even in our so-called independent countries, we still have elements of the monarchy ruling our most prized institutions and systems? For example, the Governor General, an element left over for the monarchy, is still our head of state and thus the head of our political system, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are still using the Privy Council. Mr. Speaker, I beg for 20 seconds to wrap up my speech.
Granted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are still using the Privy Council as our final appellate jurisdiction. Is it because we as a people have more confidence in the monarch? I'm just saying, Mr. Speaker, I thank you.
Honorable Member for St. Andrew, for St. Mark East,
Thank you, Mr.
and Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as the Minister of Agriculture, this issue would be very emotional for me, so I would like to ask for permission to read.
Proceed.
Mr. Speaker, having independence allows diversity in agriculture, or in the agricultural sector, as we say, and in our country. Mr. Speaker, with proper management of the agricultural sector, an independent nation can produce crops it needs, whereas under colonialism, we produce what the master needs. Take a look at all the fundings and partnerships available to continue the development of agriculture in this great nation. Mr. Speaker, in 2018, there were a number of short-term courses available in China, to which many young persons were afforded the opportunity to travel there. Many of these courses would be beneficial in the agricultural sector. Mr. Speaker, through you, I ask the opposition, can you really not see the value of our nation being independent? Mr. Speaker, Grenadians were set to the target of feeding themselves for the first time in 1980. after we would have been an independent nation. We call this self-sufficiency. Mr. Speaker, the population was encouraged through the media and government to grow more foods. Concerns for all Grenada's agriculture emanated from the realization that over the foreseeable future, this sector will continue to be, and I quote, the main supplier of food, a major earner of foreign exchange, a weapon against unemployment, and a means of increasing self-reliance based on the full development of our main resource. End quote. Honorable Maurice Bishop, 1982, may continue to rest in peace. Mr. Speaker, today our government, through the leadership of this very Prime Minister, seeks to regain a vision that the opposition in their reign failed to acknowledge as a great vision. Mr. Speaker, a number of numerous programs are being initiated to attract our youths in agriculture and significantly reduce the level of unemployment. Mr. Speaker, would we have been able to do these things if not for our independence? A number of grants and other fundings have already been given to unemployed young persons who have identified land in their neighborhoods and indicated the manner in which they wish to prepare to work it as a cooperative. As the saying goes, marry idle lands with idle hands. In 2017, Mr. Speaker, the Caribbean Development Bank approved a loan of US $5 million to support climate, smart agriculture, and enterprise business development in Grenada. The project has assisted the government in efforts to increase productivity and the contribution of the agricultural sector to economic growth, rural poverty, reduction.
Honorable Member, are you saying that the project has already started to contribute? And if I may say, I know the project has only recently started a few months ago, so are you saying that the project has already started?
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, the project will assist.
Thank you.
Rural poverty reduction and environmental sustainability. Mr. Speaker, through you, I say to the opposition, these are things that were not done under the monarchy. Do you honestly believe these programs could have been dictated by our people if not for our independence, if not for the freedom to choose who we make alliances with? Let us think long and hard about our standings on this matter. As my past primary school teachers said, forward ever, backward never. I thank you.
Are there any other contributions to the motion? Honorable Member for St. Patrick West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I stand here and I'm appalled. I've listened to the preposterous words that were uttered by these honorable members of the government, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, you know what? I will omit my original speech and I'll deal with the matter as I see fit here, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's like this government is playing in the river, on the bank. It's either we're independent or we're dependent, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, usually I am a woman of many words, but today, Mr. Speaker, I choose to be otherwise, as I believe the truth needs no defense. It is quite evident and obvious that being under the monarchy far outweighs being an independent nation, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I return to office to claim my rightful position as Minister of Social Development, I wonder what will be left of it, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are considered to be a third world country, and so we are treated as such, Mr. Speaker. Let us compare the quality of infrastructural development of that of our independent Grenada and the British system where we once belonged. Can't you see it is much better there than here, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, in Grenada, this government will put forward that infrastructure and construction is driving economic growth, Mr. Speaker. But I ask, where is the development? Mr. Speaker, the government say and they boast about how much homes they would have built, how many roads they would have paved, and how many schools they would have built, Mr. Speaker. Let us stop putting quantity over quality. Yes, it is being done, but to what quality, Mr. Speaker? That is important. Mr. Speaker, if you keep doing things that are wear and tear, eventually it will wear and tear, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what sense does it make wasting the country's resources on things that have to keep being repeated, Mr. Speaker? We need to see rural cities being developed, the transportation network, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we know the situation with our transportation system here. Just yesterday, Mr. Speaker, I had to walk over 1 hour because I got to Grenville and could not get a bus to get home, Mr. Speaker. I mean, come on, Mr. Speaker. We need to see our economy and the people prosper. We need to see sustenance. We need to see people's self-esteem being built. And most importantly, improve standard of living. Mr. Speaker, food security is fundamental to any nation. Isn't that correct? Then how come 2.2% of Grenada total's expenditure is on agriculture? Under the monarchy, such could have never happened because our rural economy and community-based development would have been top priority, Mr. Speaker. And in a return, higher income and more jobs would have been created. Mr. Speaker, when you hear mention being made about a 5-star hotel at Richmond Hill, Mr. Speaker, what is the official name? Let me remind you, Her Majesty's Prison. Who is Her Majesty? Then don't you think we were better off remaining under the monarchy? Let us take a look at our monies. Who is this beautiful lady on our dollar bill, Mr. Speaker, on our $5 bill, Mr. Speaker? The Queen, who is the head of the British system, the British monarchy, which we once belonged to, Mr. Speaker. If we happen to be in a world crisis with our independent self, Mr. Speaker, do you think we can sustain ourselves? No man is an island. But the way we depend on the Republic of China, Mr. Speaker, better we were under a monarchy with the Republic of China. Mr. Speaker, because it is evident that being in ties with China way far outweighs being independent, Mr. Speaker, don't you think? Mr. Speaker, if we wish to take a look at our independent nation, I want us to take a 40-minute trip with Leah down to Trinidad, Mr. Speaker. Trinidad and Tobago. We shall not even get out of the region, just 40 minutes. And let us take a page from the book. Then we can sing boldly and brag and beat our chest on the 7th of February 2019, Hail Grenada, land of ours. Let's journey further to Anguilla, who is still under the British monarchy. Perfect example. The social security system provides the availability of benefits for maternity, persons with disabilities and diseases. Do we have that here, Mr. Speaker? No, but Anguilla is still a part of the British monarchy, Mr. Speaker. Quickly, if I may just list a few basic advantages of being under a monarchy. 1, it can lead to leadership stability. 2, it allows for non-partisan leadership and politics. Therefore, everyone is entitled and not being given based on who you support, Mr. Speaker. It encourages respect for the ruler, Mr. Speaker. It brings about a solid government. And since this government loves money, 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 did you know that it is cheaper to run a monarchy? Mr. Speaker, I am not unmindful of the limited time that I have. So I just beg for 30 seconds to wrap up, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable member, you have 15.
Mr. Speaker, before I conclude, and I know that I will be leaving you in the capable hands of my team, I want to urge the government to take a trip to any optical center of their choice and adjust or add something to their present vision condition, because they need to see clearly that being under a monarchy far outweighs being an independent nation.
Thank you, Honorable Member. Please take your seat. Honorable Member for St. Andrews Southwest and Minister for Economic Development and Trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I heard the last presentation. And in that last presentation, it was said that it is much better over there than here. I would like to remind the opposition to you, Mr. Speaker, that it was at the cost of who? I also heard...
Honorable Member, are you referring to the other side? When you said over here, then there, are you referring to the other side of...
She made the statement, Mr. Speaker, that it is better in Great Britain than that of Great
Can you clarify where she was speaking of when she said over here and,
she said,
and over
she
there?
Said it was better over there than here, and she was referring to the colonial masters.
Honorable Member for St. Patrick West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand on a point of order.
Please state.
Mr. Speaker, through you, I would like to ask the honorable member to stop referring to members as she, and please use the portfolio and maintain the decorum of this House. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Member for St. Andrews Southwest. Please adhere to the principles of this House.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. It was also said that it allows, that under a monarchy allows for better leadership. It reminds me of the 1995 transition to power in Uganda, when a 3-year-old young man was the head of the throne. The young boy ran to his mother's lap. Is this the kind of leadership? Is this the kind of stability that we are talking about? Mr. Speaker, I've heard them question our independence, making reference to China. Mr. Speaker, there is a difference between giving up your territorial sovereignty and creating an economic framework for trading and investment. Mr. Speaker, under being an independent nation, Mr. Speaker, gives us the opportunity to make decisions based on the collective and honest ideas of its people. Under a monarchy, Mr. Speaker, it is ruled by one. They assume the majority of our taxation, and they also dictate its spending. Mr. Speaker, as an independent nation, we have an opportunity to invest in priority sectors, Mr. Speaker, which will in turn, Mr. Speaker, facilitate innovation and productivity, which is important in any developing country. Mr. Speaker, this brings me to my second point. How can we dare allow, Mr. Speaker, I ask for 30 seconds to conclude.
Honorable Member, are you trying to short-tail yourself? You have 1 minute till the next bell.
Mr. Speaker, as an independent nation, internal security is at a greater level. Mr. Speaker, what happens Mr. Speaker, when leadership is passed down to someone who is either cruel and has no remorse for our people. What other choice do we have but to sit under that leadership, Mr. Speaker?
Honorable Member for South St. George.
Mr. Speaker, I stand on a point of order.
Please state.
Mr. Speaker, was the honorable member dancing in the House?
Honorable Member, I know we're a bit emotional and all excited, but please contain your body gestures. Please proceed. Although your time has ended, I will give you 20 seconds to complete.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to see a future for Grenada where Grenadians are in charge of Grenada and where our legislative processes aren't handed over to a single ruler and a single person. I believe in economic prosperity, and I believe in a chance for the minority to be heard. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Member for St. George Southeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, honorable members of this honorable House, specially invited guests, and viewers around the world. Be it resolved that the benefits of being an independent nation far outweigh the benefits of being under the monarchy. Mr. Speaker, I must initially say, I understand.
Honorable Member, before you continue, to ensure that fairness is across the board, I would like you to refrain from all the hand gestures as to keep every member comfortable and safe.
Okay, Mr. Speaker. I understand. It has always been the aspiration of man to embody the title of being independent. Every man wants to be independent. But, Mr. Speaker, as the opposition's appointed liaison for the Ministry of Finance and Climate Resilience and National Security, and simply a man of the people, I cannot agree with this resolution. Mr. Speaker, in no way am I advocating for colonization nor lamenting regret over the realization of our independence on February 7, 1974. I am not. But, Mr. Speaker, within my portfolio, within my capacity as a financial analyst and an expert within my field, I must point out the direct advantages of such a change. Hence, I will name a few. First, we'd have lower cost of living because of economical stability under monarchy rule. We'd have higher minimum wage. In a document posted to minimumwage.com, it is stated that our minimum wage within Grenada ranges from $4.50 to $9 per hour, and that is an EC equivalent. Mr. Speaker, in that very same document, or from that exact same source, it was also derived that the British Virgin Islands, which is under the British monarchy, also has a minimum wage, which, and I quote, $6 per hour, end quote. That is the equivalent of $16.02 in EC. Mr. Speaker, as the students who attend these schools, as people who are listening, minimum wage is afforded to those who are not afforded the best of jobs. Now, in looking at the quality of life of our citizens and those who may fall below that strata, wouldn't they like to make $16 an hour? Wouldn't that college dropout like to make $16 an hour? Wouldn't that single mother who cashes at the supermarket like to make $16 an hour? And the most important point of all, we would have lower to non-existent national debt. It is quoted on countrymeters.info. Our national debt summates to 2.2 billion US dollars. Yes, 2.2 billion US dollars. Which, if I must re-emphasize for the sake of our government, it is quite a lot for such a small state. And under monarchy rule, we would not be subject to such strenuous borrowing habits. Mr. Speaker, I am completely mindful of my time limitation, and so I do not wish to go into so much detail. But in closing, Mr. Speaker, may I regale our honorable members, along with you and our viewers and invited guests, a recap of the very deliberations that we had within this House last week, Thursday. Mr. Speaker, I stood at this very spot and was victim to have to unlook to the travesty that our government advocated for the not legalization, my apologies, decriminalization of marijuana. And in my financial capacity, my financial knowledge and capacity, I know the reason behind it. But in making their presentations, they made fickle reason why it should be done, which I cannot recap and I would not substantiate by repeating. Mr. Speaker, it was you, our very honorable and impartial Mr. Speaker, who questioned the eludings of our honorable Prime Minister's.
Honorable Member, I don't want to interrupt you in any way, but I would like to know where you're getting at with your revision.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Please get to the point quickly.
All right. Mr. Speaker, I'm saying this, that when you questioned our honorable Prime Minister, he made clear statement that their whole and solely argument for the decriminalization of marijuana was financially based. And Mr. Speaker, with all my knowledge, there is no moral compass there. I am saying this to point out that within his rebuttal, his closing argument, he completely went against the resolution and supported our side, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm saying this to point out, and not only to commend him for making the morally sound decision, but Mr. Speaker, to point out his mortality. He is only human, and it took him a matter of moments to get to a better decision and to make sense of what he was saying. Mr. Speaker, in pointing out that our honorable Prime Minister is only human, I will allude and implore to those of you, my colleagues, honorable members of the government, onlookers, those who possess the ability to weigh consequences and reward efficiently and effectively, that money not be your guide to making these decisions, that making decisions keep all parties in mind. Mr. Speaker, as I conclude, I beg, I implore, I pray that God gives the insight necessary to make the right decision today, Mr. Speaker, and that we, as members of this honorable House, do not support this resolution. Thank you.
Honorable Member for St. Andrew Northwest and Minister for Social Development, Housing and Religious Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the motion. Mr. Speaker, as I begin, I must say it seems to me that the members of the opposition is really in love with China. As one member said, China, China, China. The Great Britain accept help from China. Mr. Speaker, the mighty America's biggest trade deals are with China. Yet my opponent seems to have a problem with tiny Grenada accepting assistance from China, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering Why do they miss the hands down from Great Britain, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, when I listen to them, all I see is double standard. I can stand here today, Mr. Speaker, for times without end and speak of all the development we have had socially, especially as it relates to low-income housing in Grenada, which began under the visionary leadership of the great Sir Eric Machigiri. His government constructed the first ever low-income housing project in River Road. Since then, Mr. Speaker, every government, including this government, has continued his vision, adding housing projects to almost every parish in Grenada, including Carriacou and Petit-Martinique, who just witnessed the completion of the first phase at the Dumfries low-income housing. However, Mr. Speaker, our emotional and cognitive development is just as important as our physical development. Hence the reason I choose to tow a different route here this morning, Mr. Speaker. Equal rights for all. My government believes that no one should be left behind. Mr. Speaker, look at this honorable house. I also implore my members of the opposition to take a look around, but especially to look at who is sitting in the seat at the head of the table, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our independence was able to eradicate inequality. Hence the reason, Mr. Speaker, myself and other women are able to stand or sit in this honorable house, Mr. Speaker, I don't think I need to remind the opposition this was not an opportunity afforded to us before, Mr. Speaker. Since our independence, we have had 3 female presidents of the Senate, 2 female governor generals, and 18 women sitting right here in this House of Representatives, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at present, 7 of our 15 senior parliamentarians, an equivalent of 47%, is female representation, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have a female governor general and 4 females sitting in the Senate, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, I say, look at this honorable house. The leader of the opposition is a woman, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't think I need to reiterate or to count the ratio of men to women in this honorable house today, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable member for St. John East.
Mr. Speaker, I stand on a point of clarity.
Please state.
The honorable member stated that we had 2 past Governor General. I would like if she can provide for us the name of the first.
Honorable member.
Mr. Speaker, I think that is general knowledge, so the honorable member should know that.
Honorable member, please state the names of the 2 that you refer to.
So Hilda Baino and Dame Cecil Lagrinat. Madam Hilda Baino, sorry.
Honorable member for St. John.
Mr. Speaker, based on my knowledge, so Miss Hilda Baino, sorry, was a governor and not a governor general.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Speaker, correction noted, but in my view, they're among to the same post.
Proceed.
Compared to Anguilla, Mr. Speaker, an island still ruled by a monarchy, they have had only 5 women sitting in their House of Assembly. In 1972, Idalia Grumps. In 1976, Albina Lake Hodge. Mr. Speaker, it took them more than 30 years for them to see again 3 women sitting in their House of Assembly, when in 2015, 3 more women was elected to the House, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I continue, please permit me to read an excerpt from a recently held seminar here in Grenada on women in politics. Mr. Jarvis Mattia, the Director of Operations of the Commonwealth, said, Grenada is ranked 5th out of 190 countries around the world by the Inter-Parliamentary Union for Women's Representation in elected seats. He further stated, of parliaments across the Commonwealth, Grenada is second only to Rwanda for gender balance. Mr. Speaker, the power of women is recognized globally, but looking at both sides today, Mr. Speaker, I must say that power holds an extra significance for all of us, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Member for St. Patrick East.
Mr. Speaker, it's on a point of clarity.
Please state.
Mr. Speaker, through you, I would like to find out from the Minister of Social Development, is she actually the Minister of Social Development or the Minister for Female Evolution?
Honorable Member, please continue.
Mr. Speaker, it seems to me that my opponent does not really understand my post. Mr. Speaker, we are mindful of the challenges confronting us, Mr. Speaker, but my government is forging forward as achieving substantial gender... Mr. Speaker, I do beg for a minute to complete my...
45 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My government is forging forward as achieving substantial gender equality remains our target. Mr. Speaker, empowerment is for everyone, man, woman, and child. And I believe, my government believes, that empowerment should mean empowering our locals, not fashioning our society to benefit a monarchy, a state that does not understand the plight of the small man. Don't get me wrong, Mr. Speaker, we are not perfect. In fact, we are far from perfection like every other society. And I will never claim that we are, Mr. Speaker, but the mentality of some is why they cannot and will not see the benefits of our independence, Mr. Speaker. Because in their own mind, they are still enslaved. Mr. Speaker, through you, I beg my opponents, do not limit your minds. Do not just look at what is physically present. Every aspect of our society counts. I thank you.
Are there any other contributions to the motion? Honorable Member for St. Patrick East.
Mr. Speaker, I stand here proudly today with these esteemed colleagues, and I know they have done a good job in this House today, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I sat here and I remembered more than one member referred to the Minister of Social Development and said she will let us know. The minister will let us know. And I'm still waiting. I'm still waiting to hear how, when, did Mr. Speaker, all about our social development, I'm still waiting. Where have we moved forward there? I'm still waiting for her to give me those information. Mr. Speaker, when I sit and I listen to the Minister of Education, it baffled me. And as my colleague said, it seems that we're going with quantity over quality. Mr. Speaker, it seems that the Minister of Education have not taken a good trip around this island lately to look at our schools. Mr. Speaker, just yesterday, I had the privilege to travel, as we call the countryside. And when I looked at the buildings of some of our secondary schools, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Member, I know your nails are well done and you would like others to see, but too many hand gestures, and I would like you to refrain from so much body language. Proceed.
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, but my emotions have run wild with me there for a second. I'm sorry. Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, I so happened to visit the countryside, as we say. And when I looked at some of our school buildings, especially one of our secondary schools, Mr. Speaker, it brought tears to my eyes. And not just a little teardrop, Mr. Speaker. It had me on my knees, Mr. Speaker, to look at that said school, if I may say, Mr. Speaker. When I looked at the Grenada Seventh-day Adventist Secondary School, and I looked at that building, I wonder where is our Minister of Education? And yet she has been saying, and I asked for clarity, and I was not given, on the improvement of the work sector. So if we get that improvement in our work sector, Mr. Speaker, then I should have seen improvement in our educational system. I would have seen improvement with our
Honorable
buildings.
Member for St. John West.
Mr. Speaker, I stand on a point of clarity.
Please state.
The honorable member on the other side stated that the building at the Grenada Seventh-day Adventist School was in a deplorable condition. However, I'd like the member to clarify, is the building still in use?
Honorable member, do you wish to clarify?
Mr. Speaker, yes. The Grenada Seventh-day Adventist School that we are referring to has two parts, two sets of buildings. And one building, it's not in use. That could never be in use, Mr. Speaker. That building could never be in use. And if that building is in use, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Labor need to go over to the Minister of Education office and sit with her and have a good talk to start doing something about that building. Also the Minister of Health, because I know if my child attends that school, my child will be coming home sick every day, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it baffles me, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to education, it goes to my heart very well, Mr. Speaker. It baffles me. Mr. Speaker, I sincerely believe that some persons in here really need to visit the optical center of their choice to adjust or add to present vision condition we are having today. Mr. Speaker, as one of our colleagues who is not present with us here today, as he rightfully says, Mr. Speaker, permit me please to quote from him. As I quote from that colleague, Father, hear me groan. I end of quote. Mr. Speaker, I don't understand why that honorable member always asks, Father, hear me groan. Mr. Speaker, can you permit me 1 minute, please, as I wrap up?
Honorable member, you have 30 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, I know you and everybody in here is very familiar with the story, Jonah and the whale. Mr. Speaker, our people cried out and said they wanted a change. They got the change. But Mr. Speaker, me and my team are just waiting in the bellies of the whale to be vomited back. So that we know when we come back here in office, Mr. Speaker, all what they did there, all the comments they made in this honorable house, will be able to clean it up. Not just sweep it under the carpet, Mr. Speaker, but clean it up, and clean it up good, Mr. Speaker, because I know, I'm very confident in my colleagues. And we, as people for our country, Mr. Speaker, our little nation, I know we can move our nation forward, Mr. Speaker. They talk about independent, but Mr. Speaker, I'm still waiting.
Thank you very much, honorable member. Please take your seat. Honorable member for St. George Northwest and the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as we wind down this morning's Youth Parliament, I would like to point out something that I've noticed. Mr. Speaker, it seems like the members on the other side are suffering from a severe state of cognitive dissonance. Mr. Speaker, allow me to clarify. Mr. Speaker, the honorable member for St. George South East made mention to our Parliament sitting last Thursday, where the other side bashed the government, stating that our aim was simply finance, Mr. Speaker. Now today, they have shown the hypocritical side by twisting that very argument to use it in their favor, Mr. Speaker. Now they are saying, look at those islands that have remained under the monarchy. They are more economically developed than we are. Forgetting, Mr. Speaker, the social and moral foundation that exists here within our country. The very same thing that they bashed us for last Thursday. Mr. Speaker, how can we sit in this honorable house and say to the Grenadian people that a system that oppressed us, a system that suppressed our voice, Mr. Speaker, is better than what we have today, where every member, every citizen of this country, Mr. Speaker, has the right to cast their ballot in an electoral process. Mr. Speaker, George L. Beckford, in his book, Persistent Poverty, Underdevelopment in Plantation Economies of the Third World, made it very clear that less than 4,000 people within the British territories before independence came, Mr. Speaker, were able to cast their vote. One thing was common among all of them, Mr. Speaker. They were landowners, Mr. Speaker. They were wealthy people, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the honorable members made mention to Anguilla, and they said that under the monarchy, you have low national debt. Mr. Speaker, allow me to draw the attention and the attention of this honorable house to Anguilla's Chief Minister and Minister for Finance, Mr. Victor Banks. While addressing Anguilla's House of Assembly in 2017, December 5th, he said, quote, Anguilla's public debt at the end of 2016 stood at 45% GDP, which would represent 97.09% in a 97.09% increase over the 2015 debt stock. Mr. Speaker, what were they speaking of? Mr. Speaker, it is within my knowledge that the Mungay Hospital is still in operation. Mr. Speaker, that is the place where these members should be, not in this honorable house. Mr. Speaker, the sheer hypocrisy that comes from the other side. This building, Mr. Speaker, came as a result of strong bilateral ties with governments across the world, Mr. Speaker. The very members on the other side have bashed our bilateral relations and said that is not a symbol of our independence. Mr. Speaker, I am saddened that the people of this country have to live with an opposition that seems to be morally bankrupt. Mr. Speaker, one of the honorable members on the other side made mention to free visa travel to Britain. Allow me to draw the attention, Mr. Speaker, to the Windrush generation. This was a group of people who traveled to Great Britain, Mr. Speaker, while we and other Caribbean countries were still members of the British colony, Mr. Speaker. They worked and lived as British citizens for years. They paid taxes for years. Now, Mr. Speaker, what is happening to these people? They are being deported back to their country and being considered non-British citizens. What were they talking about earlier on, Mr. Speaker? I find this madness. Mr. Speaker, this team, I am confident, is the best team to continue the economic and fiscal development that Grenada seems to enjoy. Mr. Speaker, as a result of the hard work of this team, Grenada remains the fastest growing economy in the region, averaging real growth of 5% since 2013. Even when compared to Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Anguilla. What does those three islands have in common, Mr. Speaker? Martinique is still still part of France, Guadeloupe is still a part of France, and Anguilla is part of Britain. They are not independent. And a small independent island in the Western Hemisphere seems to be outperforming these islands economically. And they stand here, Mr. Speaker, in this honorable house and say to us that we are better off as a dependent. Mr. Speaker, I feel sorry that you had to bear the burden of listening to this nonsense. Mr. Speaker, it hurts my heart, Mr. Speaker. It hurts my heart to stand here. Mr. Speaker, look at the invited guests in this room. They had to bear the burden. Our children who are in secondary school and tertiary education, Mr. Speaker, have to listen to this, Mr. Speaker. It is very sad.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member for St. George South East, we went to the same secondary school. I believe he is more competent than this. I am not 100% sure if his affiliation with the members of the opposition has reduced and impeded his intelligence. But, Mr. Speaker, I know him, and he is a man of good character. And I said, through you, Mr. Speaker, I would like to say to him, do not allow the members on the other side who are morally void and intellectually challenged to impede his abilities, because I know he knows better, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, finally, they said that the members on the other side said, Mr. Speaker, that under the monarchy there is equality. Mr. Speaker, monarchies don't promote equality. The Minister for Social Development made clear that. Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure if the Honourable Opposition Leader was asleep while the Minister for Social Development was speaking. But, Mr. Speaker, she reminds me, the Honourable Opposition Leader, reminds me of a former Member of Parliament who used to sleep. Mr. Speaker, these members on the other side, opposing themselves, or maybe transposing themselves, to be the next government. But, Mr. Speaker, the Grenadian people are not stupid. I am confident that they are smarter than these members on the other side. Allow them to be. Mr. Speaker, I would like to say thank you to my team members for gracing me with the opportunity to speak in this honorable house as the head of government and Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. I am confident that in the coming years, Grenada will continue to see and benefit from the important fiscal measures that we have put in place to continue benefiting and improving the lives of the citizens of this country. Mr. Speaker, thank you.
The question is that the following resolution be agreed. Whereas control of the state of Grenada was disputed by Great Britain and France in the 18th century, with Britain ultimately prevailing with the Treaty of Versailles on the 3rd September 1783, and whereas under the Associated Statehood Act on March 3rd, 1967, Grenada was granted full autonomy over its internal affairs, and whereas on the 7th February 1974, Grenada became a fully independent state and continued to practice a modified Westminster parliamentary system based on the British model with a Governor-General appointed by and representing the British monarch, and a Prime Minister who is both leader of the majority party and the head of government. And whereas independence means a condition of a nation, country, or state in which its residents and population, or some portion thereof, exercise self-government and usually sovereignty over the territory. Be it resolved that the political, economic, social, and other benefits from being an independent nation far outweighs the dependency on a monarchy. As many are in favor that the resolution be agreed, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, say no.
No.
Honorable Member for St. Andrew North East.
Mr. Speaker, I stand to beg for a division of votes.
Honorable Nelon Franklin, Prime Minister, St. George Northwest. What do you say? Yea or nay?
Yea.
Honorable Member for St. John West. What do you say? Yea or nay?
Yea.
Honorable Member for Carriacou and Petit Matnik. What do you say? Yea or nay?
Yea.
Honorable Member St. Andrew Southwest. What do you say? Yea or nay?
Yea.
Honorable Member St. Andrew Northeast. What do you say? Yea or nay?
Yea.
Honorable Member St. Patrick West. What do you say? Yea or nay?
Yea.
Honorable Member St. Mark East. What do you say? Yea or nay?
Yea.
Honorable Member St. David East. What do you say? Yea or nay?
Sorry. Yea.
Honorable Member St. Andrew Northwest. What do you say? Yea or nay?
Yea.
Honorable Member St. Patrick East. What do you say? Yea or nay?
I resound the nay.
Honorable Member St. John East. What do you say? Yea or nay?
Nay.
Honorable Member St. Mark. What do you say? Yea or nay?
Nay.
Honorable Member St. George Northeast. What do you say? Yea or nay?
Nay.
Honorable Member for the Town of St. George. What do you say? Yea or nay?
Nay.
Honorable Member for South St. George. What do you say? Yea or nay?
Nay.
Honorable Member St. David West. What do you say? Yea or nay?
Nay.
And Honorable Member St. George East. What do you say? Yea or nay?
Nay. Nay.
With a vote of 9 to 8, the ayes have it. The ayes do have it. The resolution has been agreed. Honorable Member for St. Patrick West.
Mr. Speaker, I stand and ask that this House stand adjourned until the next sitting deemed necessary.
All those in favor that the House be adjourned, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, say no. The ayes have it. The ayes do have it. The business of this Youth Parliament stands adjourned. Before we exit out of the House, we would like to name the individual speaker who would have received the highest score. That individual speaker would have been the Honorable Member for St. George Northwest and Prime Minister, Minister for Finance and National Security and Climate Resilience, Mr. Nelon Franklin. Sign, need I.
The Grenada government is committed to improving the lives of citizens. Government announces early payment of January salaries for public officers.
Traditionally, government would make payments to public officers on the second to last day of the month. In this case, for January 2019, we have decided to make early payments to public officers on the 21st of this month. This has not been done in over a decade.
Public officers to get a 4% salary increase.
You would recall that the government would have negotiated with the trade unions for a 10% increase for public officers over a 3-year period. 2017, 3%, 2018, 3%, and 2019, 4%. We would kick off the 4% payment, which is to the tune of $6.7 million on January 21st, 2019.
January salaries to include increments.
Every year, public officers move incrementally in their pay and grade scale. This year, we are paying increments to the tune of $3.6 million, and that would also be included in the January 21st payment.
Will pensioners also benefit?
Pensioners' income is indexed to the salary increases of the public officers. So the 4% increase that public officers is due for 2019, pensioners would also benefit from that 4% increase.
Your government at work, delivering on promises made. Government pension. What are the facts? Are all public workers entitled to pension? Are public workers owed gratuity? Here are the facts. Fact 1. The Pension Disqualification Act of 1983 was validated on April 21, 1985 by the democratically elected government led by former Prime Minister Herbert A. Blaise. This means that public workers employed after February 22, 1985 are not legally entitled to a pension from the government of Grenada. Fact 2. The judgment in the Hermelin Armstrong case does not create legal precedents for the reinstatement of pension to public workers employed after February 22, 1985. The judgment created a legal precedent only for those workers who joined the public service in a pensionable post between April 4, 1983 and February 22, 1985. There were 56 such workers. The government restored pension to those 56 workers in 2018 at a cost of $7.7 million. Fact 3. All officers employed in a pensionable post who joined the service after February 22, 1985 are not legally entitled to a pension from government. They are only entitled to a pension from NIS once they meet the necessary requirements as per the NIS Act. Fact 4. The Cabinet's decision in 2016 to reform pension is rooted in moral and social justice principles, and it is not a legal obligation. Therefore, any agreement on pension is a win for public workers. Fact 5. The MOU signed between government, the unions, and the staff associations in February and March 2018 stated that the pension regime which will be implemented must be affordable and sustainable. Fact 6. The proposed pension regime for public workers employed between February 22, 1985 and December 31, 2018, as stated in the MOU, is a non-contributory pension plan. Therefore, no deductions will be taken from workers' salaries to finance their pension from government. Pensioners also benefit from any future negotiated salary increases. Fact 7. It was agreed by all parties that a worker's annual pension would be a minimum of 70% of their final salary to be paid jointly by the NIS and the government of Grenada. Fact 8. Government is not obligated to offer an advanced pension payment commonly called a gratuity. Government has proposed to make an advanced pension payment of 2% of full pension, an amount it can practically and reasonably afford given its current and projected revenue stream. It should be noted that an advanced pension payment is a non-interest-bearing loan that the government grants to the pensioner, which must then be repaid in equal monthly installments in the form of a reduced monthly pension over 12.5 years. Fact 9. Under the proposed 2% advanced pension payment or gratuity, retirees will be entitled to a higher monthly pension than if a larger advanced payment was given. Fact 10. If the government accommodates any higher rate of gratuity, the implications would be severe for the country, as this will translate to higher taxes such as VAT, income tax and property tax, higher import duties, the possibility that hundreds of millions of dollars in grants would be lost, lower expenditure in critical areas such as healthcare, agriculture, roadworks and youth development, retrenchment of workers. These are the facts. Government is committed to an amicable resolution to the pension matter for the good of all Grenadians.
A new home is identified to house Grenada's law courts. Details to this story and more coming up in the National Report. Welcome back with the details to the news for today, Tuesday, January 22nd. I am Wendy Edmond. The Grenada government has identified a new home to house the country's law courts. Attorney General Dashan Ramdani announced Tuesday during the government's weekly post-cabinet briefing that the Clico building on Yonge Street will be leased to house 4 courts and judges' chambers and administrative offices. Adequate facilities for the country's courts have been an issue for several months, and government has explored several options to resolve the matter. The Attorney General says that the lease arrangements are currently being finalized and the building retrofitted to accommodate the courts.
I am pleased to be the bearer of good tidings when I say that we are on the cusp of resolving this issue. The government has agreed to lease space, a building in Yonge Street, that is the Clico building. Those arrangements are being finalized as we speak.
Mr. Ramdani says government has been working consistently for months to find a new home for the law courts since it was moved from the old Lime building on the Carnage due to health and environmental concerns.
For a brief period last year, there was the use of the Kaipo building to house one of the civil courts and the Court of Appeal. All of this meant that the administration had been diverting funds for other important matters into securing new facilities for the court. You may not realize I am in this singular position where I have been on the outside like you, looking on, seeing on the outside the efforts of the administration. I am now placed on the inside. And as Attorney General, I intend to be playing an integral technical part in these matters. The Minister of Legal Affairs is very concerned about this, and so is the administration.
2 criminal and 2 civil courts will be housed at the Clico building.
There will be some retrofitting to be done. We expect that there will be 4 courts housed in that building, 2 civil courts and 2 criminal courts, of course with the judges' chambers and the other administrative things in place.
Finding a new home for the courts demonstrates government's commitment to good governance and the administration of justice. And in response to this development, the Grenada Bar Association has issued a statement saying it looks forward to the successful conclusion of the process, as well as the speedy and proper execution of repairs and outfitting works which will be necessary before the High Courts may commence occupation. In this other story, the Grenada government announced Tuesday that it is making plans to host the Grenada Secondary School Games in March this year to ensure that students are not deprived of any opportunity to showcase their talents. Government's decision is in response to the cancellation of the Intercol Games by the Grenada Association of Principals of Secondary Schools. Making the announcement at this week's post-cabinet press briefing, Minister for Education, Honorable Emmeline Pearce, said the staging of national games should not be dependent on the industrial climate.
We do not believe that as responsible citizens, we do not believe as a responsible government that the children of our nation should be held hostage in this regard, should pay the price for whatever is happening between government and the union.
Minister Pearce says Intercol has been an excellent opportunity for students to showcase their talent at the national level, since scouts from various parts of the world have visited during the games to witness the performance of the students. She added that many of our students have had the opportunity to attend colleges and universities overseas because of their athletic ability.
I'm certain that many of these students, if not all of them, may not have had the opportunity if they would have had to compete with all of the other students for scholarship on an academic basis, which means that sports would have been integral to their achievements academically and the opportunities that they have received. To not provide these students with that opportunity, to me, is denying ordinary poor children of our society an opportunity to pull their families out of poverty. It's denying them an opportunity to lift themselves up, and indeed denying them that opportunity to have a chance to succeed in life. As a government, we believe that we do have the means and the structure in place through the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Sports to do this.
Further details of the Grenada Secondary School Games will be disclosed during an upcoming press conference, the date for which will be announced. Notwithstanding the cancellation of Intercol 2019, Minister Pearce congratulated the Principals Association for its excellent work over the years to ensure the growth and development of the annual games. More efforts are being pursued to strengthen Grenada's education system. Minister for Education and Human Resource Development, Honorable Emmeline Pearce, says an Education Advisory Council and Review Committee are being established. Details from Annette Moore.
The Government of Grenada, the Cabinet, would have approved last week, Monday, and confirmed yesterday the establishment of an advisory council and an education review committee. Those two, which according to Section 9 and 178 respectively of the Education Act, should have been in place. As a matter of fact, the review board should have been over the years reviewing our education system, should have been reporting to the Minister for Education in the form of a report. That report should have been tabled by the Minister of Education in Parliament and published publicly. So we are now moving to do so, and Cabinet would have approved Mr. Michael Pearce as the chairman of that committee.
The Education Act No. 21 of 2002, Section 178(1), provides for Cabinet, on the recommendation of the Minister for Education, to appoint an 8-member Education Review Committee every 5 years, whose main task will be to review and report on the education system in Grenada. The Education Review Committee consists of the chairperson, a person who has knowledge or expertise in education, a member from the National Parent-Teacher Association, one member from a board of management, a member from each organization concerned with community development, industry and commerce, and professional services, one member from the Grenada Union of Teachers, and another appointed by the Minister on the advice of Cabinet. According to Section 179 of the Education Act, the Education Review Committee must review and report on the physical condition and maintenance of all educational institutions in Grenada, the suitability of the curriculum, the performance of students in specified assessments, annual examinations set and marked by individual schools, and examinations set by the Caribbean Examinations Council, the organization of the ministry and its delivery of education services, the teaching service, and the number, quality, and performance of teachers and other matters pertaining to the enhancement of education in Grenada. With regards to the Advisory Council, according to Section 9 of the Education Act, the Council must be comprised of the principal of the T.A. Marichaud Community College or a representative, a resident tutor of the University of the West Indies, 2 members nominated by the Grenada Union of Teachers, 2 by the Central Board of Management, and 2 by the business and professional community, 1 member nominated by the Early Education Council, 1 by the National Parent-Teacher Association, 1 by the National Students' Council, and another by Special Education. Additionally, 2 members must be appointed by the Minister for Education. The Advisory Council must advise the Minister on matters for which the Minister is responsible under the Education Act, and their duties include advising the Minister of the making of regulations on the training of teachers, the choice of textbooks, curricula, and more. For the National Report, I'm Annette Moore.
This is the National Report. More news when we return.
We are back with you to continue the work. We need you to improve our Grenada, Carriacou, and Petite Martinique. On the road to national sustainable development, we're back.
So how can we invest more in the sporting arena to bridge that gap for a lot of young people?
I think there should be more forums like this.
We need to find a way in which to combat that. Now,
join us for the next National Sustainable Development Plan 2035 Contributors Forum at the Grenada Boys Secondary School, January 24th, 7 p.m.
Welcome back with the National Report. The Ministry of Education has a new Chief Education Officer. He is Mr. David Andrew, who has been an educator for more than 20 years. Mr. Andrew, who was most recently employed as a school counselor with the Ministry of Education, Human Resource Development and Religious Affairs, assumed his new duties on Tuesday, January 22nd. We get more details from Annette Moore.
As of yesterday, the Public Service Commission has appointed Mr. David Andrew to the position of Chief Education Officer within the Ministry of Education. As we speak, I believe Mr. Andrew is being officially introduced to the staff at the ministry. Mr. Andrew would have worked in the Ministry of Education for the past couple of years, and previous to that would have been attached to one of our secondary schools.
David Andrew has been an educator for the past 25 years. He has served at some of Grenada's secondary schools and other learning institutions, including being a teacher at the Grenville Secondary School in St. Andrew for 10 years. Andrew is a trained counseling therapist, having studied at the Caribbean Nazarene College in Trinidad and Tobago. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in General Studies with a concentration in psychology and also a master's degree in counseling. In 2017, Andrew was awarded the Clinical Network Conference Scholastic Achievement Award, which is presented to an alumni or student of the Caribbean Nazarene College who has advanced the caring profession by outstanding clinical or community service and made a noticeable difference in the quality of life for many people. Andrew most recently served as a school counselor in District 4 with the Student Support Services Unit of the Ministry of Education, Human Resource Development and Religious Affairs. He was based at the St. Andrew's Anglican Secondary School with responsibility for providing clinical supervision to the counselling assistants and guidance officers in the St. David District and some in the St. Andrew District. Additionally, Andrew served as the team leader for the UNICEF-funded project Child Friendly Schools. Andrew has previously worked with the government of Trinidad and Tobago as a guidance counselor to schools with the Youth Correctional Facility and as a psychologist with one of the leading employee assistance program providers, Elder Associates Limited. For the National Report, I'm Annette Moore.
And that was the National Report for today, Tuesday, January 22nd, 2019. On behalf of all of us in the newsroom, I am Wendy Edmond, thanking you for joining.
The pride and joy of a nation is its flag. Its colors and arrangement makes it significant and stunningly beautiful. On Wednesday, February 6th, it's National Colors Day. Every proud Grenadian is asked to deck off in clothing highlighting the colors of our flag. Whether you are dressed for work, daily routines, or casual engagements, showcase the true Grenadian spirit. Every ministry, every department, and all workplaces are encouraged to join in. National Colors Day, Wednesday, February 6th, 2019. Endorsed by the National Celebrations Committee. Our people, our colors, our day. On Wednesday, February 6th, National Colors Day.
It's coming.
It's coming.
It's coming.
It's coming.
It's coming.
It's